agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing this morning?
Well, as some listeners know, we're still recovering from a grid attack by either the Putin forces or installation of NSA listening devices that knocked out power here for like most of the day yesterday. So that's why we're on late, in case people were wondering.
Yes, but we are a day late.
I'm recovered, yes, and back, yeah.
We are set to go. So, yeah, and we have, as usual, a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about the Pelosi attack and the response to that, a big Supreme Court affirmative action case, Trump's tax returns. It's not gone away, but maybe it will. And yes, kind of in honor of Trey, in a way, Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter and all the fallout from that, and maybe some final thoughts on the midterms. That's a lot. I don't know if we're going to get to all of it, but we will get to as much of it as we possibly can in just 1 second. All right, Jay. So we'll start off with that assault on Paul Pelosi, of course, the husband of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Pelosi's assailant, 42-year-old David DePape, I guess I'd call him a right-wing conspiracy theorist, told police that he was going to hold Speaker Pelosi hostage, interrogate her, and break her kneecaps if she lied to him, which he said he was certain she would do. And DePape said he wanted to break her kneecaps so that she'd have to be wheeled into Congress in a wheelchair as a message to other members that there are consequences to actions. And when DePape broke in and learned that Speaker Pelosi wasn't at home, he decided to wait for her with Paul Pelosi as her hostage. And thankfully, he was able to make a 911 call from a bathroom. And then when police arrived, DePape began hitting Pelosi with a hammer, fracturing his skull. And, you know, in one sense, this is a straightforward, I think, and tragic story. You have a mentally unstable person kind of sucked into the vortex of kind of far extremist hatred, and he acted out. But to me, it's the responses to this horrific event that maybe in a way make it even more disturbing, because almost immediately a number of entirely unfounded theories sprang up, with the one gaining the most traction, it seems, being that DePape was a male prostitute who Pelosi invited into his home and after some sort of a drunken dispute attacked him. And, this wasn't just some crazy nuts on one side of things on the right, but it was promoted in part, at least, by Elon Musk and Donald Trump. And there were also those who felt the attack was some sort of a laughing matter. And Donald Trump Jr. posted an image of a hammer and a pair of underwear with the caption, "Got my Paul Pelosi Halloween costume ready." And on the campaign trail, several Republican candidates were, similarly making light of the attack. And so, Jay, I know you think this is that the attack was a horrible thing, but I wanted to get your take on the response from Musk, Trump, and, a number of other fairly prominent commentators on the right.
Well, no, I don't think we should laugh anytime someone's assaulted, in this case, dangerously so, right? I mean, essentially an attempted murder assault with what could be a deadly weapon. So, no, I mean, it's certainly bad taste, bad ethics, sort of, to make fun of this sort of thing. And I don't know, what else to say on that. I mean, it is what it is, and I think if if there's evidence, right, that this is something other than what it seems to be, which is a crazy guy showing up at the Pelosi's residence, then obviously, okay, let's hear that evidence. But in absence of that, it's improper to just speculate and make stuff up. So, shame on them for doing so. And
But it seems to me that this sort of thing has just become almost normalized in a way that even, 5 years ago or so, 5, 6, 10 years ago. Certainly it wasn't. And that to me is the truly disturbing thing. You would think that everyone from any sector except for the total lunatic fringe could come out and say, this is a horrible thing. And, we have
against beating people with hammers.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, but yet there are people, plenty of people, like I said, and not just sort of lunatic fringe people, but, Donald Trump, who's going to be running for president, announcing his campaign in a few weeks, has no problem saying, well, I hear it was a breakout as opposed to a break in, and I wonder what's going on there. And that to me, it makes me almost physically ill.
Well, I hope you feel better, but I'm not sure what else. I mean, I would say, lunatic fringe and Donald Trump running for president, that's not, the two aren't mutually exclusive, right? So no, I think there can be some fair criticism on when there is this kind of story of what does the media tell us and when and so forth. And I think there are some fair questions because the story itself is weird, right? And I think there was some spin, and I'm going to assign some blame to the Biden administration that took this on as, well, listen, this is part of some, again, right-wing conspiracy, that this is sort of January 6th part 2 or something like that, when I think all the evidence points to this is a guy who is just plain nuts. He wasn't a particular, he dabbled in right-wing conspiracies, but he certainly dabbled in left-wing conspiracies. And he also had an invisible fairy friend who would say things to him and sometimes appeared as a bird. He lived with a prominent nudist activist, and during that time proudly posted a Black Lives Matter and a trans rights flag and all that. So I mean, my sense is this guy is not in and of himself particularly ideological. He's just a nut. Now, I think you can make the fair argument that the more noise that's pumped out there about conspiracies, so forth, these people are doing terrible things, they're taking your right to vote on both sides. It gives something for a nut to grab onto. But I don't see it as a that this guy was necessarily pushed by one narrative. I think he's just crazy. It's a lot like the Gabby Gifford shooter, right? Who again was just a seriously mentally ill person. So,
yeah, but do you agree with me with the sort of normalizing of the risk? I mean, it seems to me that now everything is. There used to be a time when there were certain things that were at least considered to be somewhat off limits. Is that you do not use an assault on somebody in this sort of way, and you say, oh well, there's an opportunity here.
Yeah. No, I think you're right there.
And there's a lot more of that, definitely, than there was in the past. Yeah. So I don't know what more there is to say about that, but it's, like I said, it when I think about it, it makes me just about physically ill, and not just the attack, but the fact that we're seeing more and more prominent people feel like it's perfectly okay to spread ridiculous, completely unfounded conspiracies about this sort of thing in service of their own, I don't know, notoriety, power, or something like that. It just makes me not quite despair, but certainly get one step closer to despairing for the fate of democracy in America. And we'll talk maybe more about that later. And I would imagine you're not quite where I'm at on that.
I'm not despairing. Like I said, I look at it and say that those kind of comments, that kind of reaction is inappropriate and in bad taste, and ought to be judged so, right? I mean, people who if you're in politics and or the media and you're there to create a favorable impression, I think that ought to create a disfavorable impression. Yeah, agreed.
All right, well, let's move on to our next thing we wanted to talk about, and that is a major Supreme Court case. This week, they heard oral arguments in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, in which the court is being asked to rule that institutions of higher education can't use race as a factor in admissions, and that's something the court held was permissible in their 2003 ruling in Grutter versus Bollinger. And in that decision was a 5-4 decision authored by Justice O'Connor. The court held that the Equal Protection Clause did not prohibit the University of Michigan's law school from considering race in admissions if it was done in a manner that was narrowly tailored and designed to further a compelling state interest in the educational benefits of a diverse student body. But it's important to note, I think, that in the opinion, O'Connor wrote, "The court expects that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary to further the interest approved today." Now, it's been 19 years since that decision, and based on the oral arguments from this last week, I'd say that the current court is going to end up kind of moving that timeline up by, 6 years in this case. And I should also mention there are actually two legal questions here. The first, that's the constitutional one I mentioned, but there's also this claim that Harvard is violating Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits institutions that receive federal funds from discriminating based on race. And Students for Fair Admissions have cited data that they allege demonstrates that Asian American applicants are less likely to be admitted than similarly qualified white, black, or Hispanic applicants, though I should also point out that this argument was rejected in lower courts. And if you listen to the questions from the court's 6 conservatives in last week's argument, they focused on things like exactly what academic benefits stem from diversity, how universities determine when they have a sufficiently diverse student body to reap those diversity benefits, and what, if any, logical endpoint there is for racial preferences in college admissions. And the conservative justices also suggested that schools could achieve student body diversity by means other than racial preferences in admissions, by things like low-income outreach programs and financial aid. Now, the court's 3 liberals pushed back on this. They emphasized that race is only one of many factors considered in admissions, and they made a case for the importance of diversity in higher education as sort of a pipeline to diversity in leadership positions in society in general. So, Jay, I thought the place we could maybe start is with that precedent from 2003. Do you think the court got it right back then before we move up to 2022?
No, I don't.
Okay, well, this is an easy one for you then, right? I mean, that's why I wanted to start there, right? So I guess maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because this is the constitutional issue, right? The Equal Protection Clause. So talk about why you think that the 5 justices in the majority there got it wrong in Grutter versus Bollinger. Yeah,
so going back to Grutter, Grutter floated a new theory. It used to be affirmative action cases, going back from like the Bakke era, was the sense that, listen, racial preferences could be justified. There would be a significant compelling interest in allowing a racial preference because of past discrimination. That this is to remedy prior discrimination by that institution that is being sued. And that was sort of the law for quite a while. And what happened was, of course, that at this point, we're sort of past that. And it's hard to say that some of the institutions, are currently discriminating or haven't been discriminating. It's one thing if you're talking about it's the 1970s and look, their policies in the 1950s were discriminatory. But I don't think that's the case, and I think that you'd be really hard pressed to make an argument that there is any college or university anywhere in the country or in the Western world, for that matter, that is in any way discriminating against minorities. I should take that back, because that sort of discriminated against particular minorities, right? Racial.
Let me back up just a second on that. So when you talk about remedying past discrimination, now I think there are a couple of ways that people might look at that as like limiting or remedying past discrimination specifically in university admissions. And then there's also the broader argument that, well, it's designed to remedy past discrimination more generally in terms of economic and educational opportunities prior to university admission, because those things, of course, have a direct or can have a direct relationship to the ability to be able to compete equally on things like standardized tests or other measures that are used by institutions, right?
Sure. But the second theory is the newer one.
Right. But I imagine you're not.
That's not. Yeah.
I'm saying you're not disputing that things like if there is in fact, and this is another point, but if there is in fact systemic, say, economic and educational discrimination in K through 12 education, then that would have an impact on, say, a black applicant's ability to compete. And you could make a case that being the case, then the state may have a compelling interest in admission standards that work to remedy that.
I could get there, right? But I'd have to have a couple things. One, that discrimination is racial in nature and not socioeconomic. And then that sort of leads to the second question: is this the narrowly tailored remedy? So I think those are my two questions, right? And I think this case, when I said discriminates against minorities, that's sort of exactly what. Let's put it this way: the universities would not discriminate against what are typically viewed as disfavored minorities, if you follow me.
Yeah, explain a little more.
Socioeconomically.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, this is exactly the argument, right? Is they will say, listen, black students are not doing as well on standardized tests. They may have more challenges in K through 12 due to whatever school system they're in. Therefore, we are going to give them, take their race into account. At the same time, we're sort of taking can account the race of Asian students who do outperform on standardized tests. Now, I think that's sort of the problem is these colleges are picking which races they would like to see give preference to, and that's
Right.
That's
gotcha.
where the constitutional problem
so you're
is.
saying
and
that
you got sort of the same issue back in sort of the 30s, 40s, 50s, where there are limits on Jewish applicants.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm going to say stuff that will probably get me in trouble here, but there are if you look at the sort of the cultural phenomenon of a lot of Asian families and sort of the tiger mom phenomenon. Education is so incredibly stressed, right? It's so pushed. It's such a part of that culture. And I shouldn't say that culture because Asian is very broad and encompasses people from half the world, right? But when you think of Asian American immigrants, the idea of working hard, of becoming, getting into a professional school, Ivy League school, and further on after that, that is so ingrained. And this is, I have some very good, so my best friends are Asian, Mike. Some very good friends who come
I'm leaving
from
that one alone, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, who come from that world though, that growing up, the expectation from kindergarten on was you're going to be a doctor. You're going to go to a big, important school, and you will be a doctor. And they did. So I mean, it's
so then the argument
to me that's sort of the same argument again that was back in the 30s, 40s with Jewish students. Again, Jewish American immigrants. There was this tremendous push on education and climbing up through education, and therefore you had a whole lot of Jewish applicants with outstanding academic records, and so good for them. Yeah, but you had a system that wanted to limit. Yeah.
So to be clear, what we're talking about here is actually like you said, the Bakke argument where preferences are okay to remedy past discrimination, and you're saying that, well, even if we accept that, and I do, and it sounds like you're willing to accept that, you're saying that, well, we need to make a distinction between discrimination that is avowedly and clearly racial, like, for instance, in for a long time where institutions had, well, pretty understood quotas, the number of Jewish students they would admit.
Or black students, it was the quota was zero.
Exactly. Right. As opposed to there being an effect on certain racial groups, but that's actually more socioeconomic than racial.
Yes.
Okay. Now, we move forward, though, and that's not the argument, though, in Grutter in 2003. The argument shifts.
The argument in Grutter then changes to say, listen, it's not the issue that you are depriving these students of admission or you're violating their rights, but you know what? You're harming everyone's rights to a diverse student body and the benefits that flow from that.
Right.
And my response would be, look, I think there certainly are benefits to a diverse student body, but do those benefits raise to the clear and compelling level that you need to find to say, listen, we're going to essentially say this is an exception to the 14th Amendment because we want to have a diverse student body, and that's where I come down as a hard no. And well, secondly, not just as clear and compelling, but is this manner that we're using to get a diverse student body the least restrictive means?
Well, let me kind of focus on that a little bit then, because so would you see there being any circumstance under which the institution or the state's interest in diversity is compelling enough to be able to allow for, in effect, an exception to the Equal Protection Clause? In any instance, because of course, if your answer to that's no, then we can, kind of move on. But
keep moving. No, could I come up with a hypothetical where you have, some school that is historically and nearly 100% white or something like that? I suppose. Do any of those exist in the real world? I sort of doubt it.
Okay. So then it's
so I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think finding that case would sort of be a needle in a haystack.
Okay, so it's a question then of not so much is there a compelling interest? Maybe it's more a question of, and this is what some of the, I think, conservative justices sort of focused on in their questions is, at what point do you know that you have enough diversity to reap those benefits without having to essentially have a carve out for the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And that's part of it. Well, the other thing, something that Justice Roberts said, which is one of these going to be great quotes for all of history, I think, is always the discussion of, listen, a college can have preferences to say, listen, our orchestra needs more oboe players. So we are going to perhaps relax academic standards or standardized test scores for someone who also plays the oboe because, hey, we need oboe players. And look, I think that's sort of the school has an interest in getting oboe players, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's no compelling interest, right? That says, and is then what Roberts followed up with is, and we didn't fight a civil war over oboe players.
And thank God.
Right?
Yeah.
Race is something different, and it's set out in the Constitution that that's one of the reasons. Yeah. So I think that's
okay. Now, and I should point out, for comparative purposes, Harvard reports that the racial makeup of its class of 2026, 40.6% white, 27.9% Asian American, 15.2% African American, 12.6% Hispanic or Latino, 2.9% Native American, and 0.8% Native Hawaiian. So, that is obviously significantly more diverse than the U.S. population in general. And I think I can understand how somebody looking at that would saying, well, at what point, have you gotten to those benefits? Yeah. And I would think when you have 40 points, and actually I should point out in their stats that they post, Harvard actually doesn't say the percentage of white. You kind of have to figure that out by subtraction from everything else, or doing math, or something like that. But I don't know. But there it is. But that's a lot more diverse than, say, Baldwin Wallace University, where you and I went to school at 77.8% white, or NKU, where I teach now, 80.3% white. So I feel like Harvard might not be the greatest test case on this if you're making that argument, because Harvard is so incredibly racially diverse as opposed to some other institutions.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. But, and I think it's tough to get to a to say that you need that if you're more diverse than the population of the country generally. And I think, look, I think there's an interest. I think there is an interest in having a student body that may be more diverse than the country in general. Particularly if you're in a region, right, that is less diverse, and you're less likely to meet different kinds of people. I think that's all great. But I think when you start saying that we're still not diverse enough, and the questions that the justice has asked, well, at what point do you get diverse enough? And the answer was sort of, well, never. We're going to keep doing this, and we'll let you know.
Yeah, that's. I think it's particularly problematic when we're talking about, again, a carve out for part of the Constitution. It's like, well, we need some sort of standards, and I would be reasonable people. I would expect to disagree as to what those standards are and how they're measured, but to just say, well, we don't know, but we're just going to assume we can just keep on sort of having this carve out for the 14th Amendment as long as we feel we need it. That's a little too nebulous for me. But that's the constitutional issue. I pointed out there's a second issue here, and I think it's a little more problematic, and that is Title VI. And Title VI reads, in part, no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in and be denied the benefits of or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Now, to me, this is an easy one. Harvard and North Carolina, they're the other respondent in this. They are clearly discriminating based on race because that's, I think, sort of an inevitable consequence of counting race as a plus factor, right? Now, I don't agree with that language. I would have written Title VI differently, but it's hard for me to see how you can argue that Harvard is not in violation of that. I don't know. Maybe. What do you think about that?
Well, the argument sort of that gets floated is sort of this like greater good argument, right? That, well, yeah, we are discriminating again by race, but that's only so that we can end discrimination. Yeah, but the right? problem, of course, the problem is Justice Roberts, who said years ago, and I think it was in his dissent in Grutter. The best way to end racial discrimination is to stop discriminating by race. Yeah, well, but I mean, it seems, like I said, I think that it's problematic how Title VI is written, but as written, it doesn't say there's not an appendix unless, of course, you're doing this for the greater good. Unless you're doing it for a good reason. Yeah. Talk about this. We've talked about this so many times in the show, where Justice Scalia said that he wished he had a stamp that said "dumb but constitutional." And so I think this was ill-advised because it is too broad and it doesn't allow for institutions to do. But just reading the pretty straightforward letter of the law here, it's hard for me to argue that Harvard is not violating Title VI. And so, I mean, to me, the answer would be to change that legislation to allow for that sort of thing. But I don't think you get to just say, well, we're violating it, but come on, guys, that just doesn't, I agree with you 100%. So I would say, who else would agree with you, Mike? Would agree with both of us.
Justice Thomas.
And that is, Justice Thomas. Yeah. He usually agrees with me. But someone who, he's not with us now, but Justice John Marshall Harlan, who was known as the great dissenter in Plessy versus Ferguson. Mm-hmm. And Harlan, I sort of got about a year or so ago, got interested in Harlan because of some of the stuff that's going on and the wokeness, right? And Harlan was the guy who dissented in Plessy. And one of the things he said was, and Plessy, just to back up, right, was the separate but equal case. Yeah. It said, listen, in train cars, there were black compartments and white compartments. And the majority of the court, everyone except Harlan, said, yeah, that's okay, because you can still discriminate. It doesn't violate the 14th Amendment as long as it's separate but equal. And of course, that's the phrase and the ideology that carried on, that sort of justified Jim Crow and carried on through up until Brown versus Ford. But what Harlan said is, the government should have no business knowing the race of the person they're dealing with. And if you look back and think about what a shocking statement that is then, and it is now, that he very much advocated for a truly colorblind society. And it's also there's some funny ironies, because in Harlan's dissent he uses phrases from the time, sort of saying, look, they hey, they even let Chinamen sit in the white section. Those are his words, not mine. But these were people who, in that case, were not American citizens. Due to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which again, there's something about, like back in the day, they didn't come up with cute acronyms to sort of tell you what a piece of legislation was about. They called it the Chinese Exclusion Act.
That's pretty straightforward.
There's no question. Like, what are we doing here? But anyway,
but I think before you move on, I think you would acknowledge that you certainly can say, well, it's problematic to say, well, we should just be a colorblind society when if there is in fact effects from longstanding systemic discrimination where somebody's basically starting well ahead, and you say, well, yeah, we're not going to discriminate anymore, but yeah, it's too bad that you're starting 20 yards behind, say, this other group, but we're going to run a fair race, and so everyone just starts where they're at. I mean, you recognize, I would think that is a legitimate argument and a legitimate concern, or maybe not. I don't know.
It's a legitimate argument, but something else to consider about Harlan's background. His family was from Kentucky and had owned slaves. He had a half brother who was a freed slave. He grew up. He was adopted by the family. It's a crazy story. That Justice Harlan had this older brother who essentially lived in the house, was black, and was about 15 years or so older than he was, and was really sort of like a mentor, uncle figure almost, more than just an older brother, and had a profound impact on his life. And that brother actually moved across the river then to Cincinnati, became a prominent politician in Cincinnati and Ohio. But anyway, again, so what I'm saying, this is someone who literally grew up with slavery and said, no, the best way to do it is just let's ignore race altogether and let people start from scratch. Now that may be naive. I think you can make the argument that that's naive. But I just, you think about what the world would have looked like if at some point you make that break. If we had made that break back at Plessy, and just said no, we're not doing any sort of looking at race, would we be in a better situation than we are now? Yeah,
I understand that argument. I have big problems with it just because for the reasons that I talked about. In a way, it really kind of reminds me of the sort of modern climate argument where you have, developed countries saying like, well, everyone needs to cut their emissions. And so India, too bad, we burned a bunch of the coal to get to the point we're at. And he's like, well, wait a second, how is this fair? And they're right. And so that's oftentimes also kind of a racial thing, is indirectly. But so I think that's the problem with that sort of colorblind argument, is it ignores, or it can ignore, the fact that there still are very big disparities that are, at least in part, the result of generations or even hundreds of years of systemic discrimination. And we just can't wish that away.
But you would agree with me, though, that the farther we get from those historic disparities, the more difficult it is to justify a racial preference or viewing anything through the lens of race.
I think it is always, I would say other things being equal, yes, I would say it is always incumbent upon the person arguing for an exception to any equal treatment based on race to justify their case and to demonstrate that they have a compelling interest, and that interest is being achieved in the narrowest possible way. So yeah. I would agree with that. No, I kind of along the same lines. It seems to me that, like I said, I would definitely be in favor of Title VI being amended to allow for some sort of limited ability to have admissions, at least in part, based on diversity with certain benchmarks, I guess, set in place. But also, even more than that, I would love a requirement that institutions that get federal funding of higher education not discriminate based on whether the applicant had a close relative attend or whether they donated to the school. And Harvard and all those other places would just be, I mean, because that's, if you take a look at the big issues in it, there's so many of those legacy and they not necessarily donated a gym, but I mean, buying your way in. And to me, that in a way is even more of a problem in certain respects. And not that that's going to happen because so many of the people making these laws are Ivy League graduates whose oxes would be gored from that.
Well, there's a wonderful irony there too, right? If on the one hand, and I can, if you really point out to how this works, right? On the one hand, you were saying, well, I'm all for, we're fine with allowing children of alumni or people who make significant donations preference in who all happen to be white, or I shouldn't say all, but most happen to be white. Just given the historic nature, deserve a leg up in admissions, but as also do minorities which had been discriminated against because of their past discrimination, because of society was backward 50, 70 years ago. And I mean, it's the exact same thing, right? Mm-hmm. It's just the other side of that coin.
Yeah. But that, again, that's the sort of thing where, the Ivy League elite ruling class would never allow that because that would just be scandalous. Right. What do you mean? My kid can't get in, doesn't have a leg up getting into Harvard because, I mean, you
understand. And again, I'll phrase this in certain ways that, here's the thing. It's one thing to say, and this is what bothers me so much about affirmative action and these kind of alleged diversity initiatives as they're practiced in higher education and other places, is that there is the sense of, here's the club, right? And we in the club will decide who gets into the club. We will magnanimously allow these minorities in the club because, they were discriminated against in the past, perhaps, to the detriment of other minorities who are not in the club. And right. We're also going to make sure we and our children stay in the club.
Exactly.
And we're going to do this, and we're going to make sure that those who might displace us from the club are not in.
Yeah.
And I think that's what this case is all about.
Yeah, that's the part of it that just galls me. Maybe that's just because, coming from sort of a very solidly working class kind of Midwestern background, that sticks in my craw a little bit, more than a little bit, as you can probably tell. So, yeah. All right. Well, let's just take a quick break and we'll be right back to talk about Donald Trump's tax returns. Yes, they're back. All right, Jay. So this week, Chief Justice John Roberts issued an order staying the ruling of the D.C. Circuit that required the Treasury Department to turn over 6 years of Donald Trump's tax returns to the House Ways and Means Committee. And Roberts further ordered that the committee respond to this by November 10th. Now, this whole dispute began back in 2019, when the committee requested Trump's personal and business returns, and in doing so citing a federal law that specifically allows the House Ways and Means Committee to obtain any return or return information. Now, the committee has stated that it wants the returns
from the president.
From any taxpayer. Yes, from any taxpayer.
Really?
That was, yes.
I thought it was a carve out relating to.
It's from any taxpayer.
Am I wrong? Okay.
But anyway, the committee said it wanted to return as part of its consideration of legislation involving how tax law should apply to a sitting president. Now, Trump's attorneys, they fought this request. They're arguing that there's no real legislative purpose here and that this is essentially a partisan witch hunt. Now, in a unanimous opinion by a 3-judge panel of the D.C. Circuit, 2 of whom were Republican appointees, the appeals court rejected Trump's arguments. Judge Senatel wrote, "The chairman has identified a legitimate legislative purpose that it requires information to accomplish. At this stage, it is not our place to delve deeper than this. The mere fact that individual members of Congress may have political motivations as well as legislative ones is of no moment." Now, this relates, though, to a 2020 case decided by the Supreme Court, Trump versus Mazars. It was a 7-2 decision with Thomas and Alito dissenting, in which Chief Justice Roberts, writing for majority, noted that disputes between the executive and legislative branches, they've traditionally been, well, worked out between those branches without judicial interference. And the court says, well, that's how we'd like this to happen, essentially. But they also found that, there were important separation of powers issues that hadn't been sufficiently considered by lower courts in that case. But even so, they didn't accept Trump's attorney's argument that there must be a demonstrated specific need for documents. They said that's too stringent, but they also rejected Congress's argument that all you need is a valid legislative purpose as too lenient. And so what they did, as the court has sometimes wanted to do, is they came up with their own test, 4 parts. The first being whether the legislative purpose requires the president's documents or if that information can be gotten elsewhere. Number 2, whether the subpoena is as narrow as possible for that legislative purpose. Number 3, whether Congress has demonstrated that they have a valid legislative purpose. And finally, the consideration of the burden that providing the evidence puts on the president. Now, the D.C. Circuit did consider this, and they applied what they called it the heightened Mazars standard, and they found that the House Ways and Means Committee's request did meet that standard. So now, again, the Supreme Court has not ruled on this. This was just simply an administrative stay by Chief Justice Roberts. So given all that background, which I think was important to kind of bring in, do you think that the Chief Justice was correct in issuing the stay?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Can you explain why?
Sure. Well, this goes to sort of the question we were talking about on other Trump privilege issues is on these kind of things. It's a bell that can't be unrung. And if this is something that there are significant separation of powers questions, then the whole court ought to hear it and you got to get a decision. And they can decide whether or not this fits in with the Mazar test. And this just sort of allows us that time to happen. So yeah, I think that's the right. And again, with these orders, you don't get an opinion with them, right? This is just a, hey, yes, we're staying it. So I look at it also as kind of, it's a no harm, no foul, right? It's just a matter of, at what point does the House committee get this information if they get it?
Yeah, and that I think is the bigger, the political question. There are certainly some who say, well, this is the conservative Supreme Court hoping to run out the clock because, of course, as almost certainly is going to happen, Republicans will at least take control of the House. And so early January, which is not that far off in legal terms, right, certainly in litigation terms, that means that request will be dropped. And so then the thinking is, well, as long as Trump's attorneys with an assist from the Supreme Court can delay this until January, just, like a few more months, then it will all go away. Trump will never have to show his tax returns. And I mean, what do you think about the likelihood of that? I mean, I feel like Roberts certainly set probably as short a period as he could, I think, for the response from the committee. But do you think that this is going to play out before the next Congress sits or not?
I think probably. Yeah.
Okay. Do you think it would be a problem?
Again, I don't know what their timetables are, but and I think regardless, this question is going to come up, or related questions are going to come up, and already have, right? For example, like the Lindsey Graham subpoena in Georgia, and there was a stay on that initially. And the court looked at it and said, no, he can go ahead and testify. So I think that's the appropriate posture to take, right? Again, because if these are separation of powers or federalism questions, as it was in Lindsey Graham, you ought not to just sort of shoot from the hip. And if these are questions the Supreme Court should look at, let's give them the opportunity to do that.
So can you explain to folks what exactly or potentially happens at this point? So Roberts issues the stay. He says to the committee, get back to us by November 10th. They do that. And then what exactly?
at that point, then I'm not positive exactly what happens because I don't have that many stays pending before Justice Roberts.
Exactly.
I think that then the court looks at it. My guess is it went to Roberts because he's the judge for the D.C. Circuit.
Yeah.
And then, like Thomas was the judge for the 11th Circuit, I believe. So then it goes to the rest of the court. I'm assuming he would do that, and they would look at it on the shadow docket, which again is not really that shadowy. It's the emergency docket, and they'd issue a ruling. So, yeah, my sense is that can happen fairly quickly.
Yeah, it seems to me that
that's why it's shadowy, right?
Yeah.
That's the whole point of the
Well, it seems to me that this is sort of a unique case because, of course, there is a specific federal law, and in many document requests, that's not the case. It's rare that Congress passes a law that says this specific committee can request these documents, right? I mean,
That's the bigger problem.
Yeah. But it seems to me that the facts and the law in question is clear enough here where there should be nothing to prevent the Supreme Court for issuing a ruling one way or another before January. And if the court and Chief Justice Roberts is concerned about the legitimacy of the court as it claims to be, then they should issue a ruling one way or another in enough time so that if they do, in fact, rule that those tax returns must be turned over, that if the ruling is issued in enough time so that those tax returns will, in fact, be turned over.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But, I guess there's a larger issue here. And, of course, I am a Democrat, and I am looking at a Congress in a few months with Jim Jordan, the chair of the Oversight Committee. And I got to say that, wow. So I'm thinking about all the document requests, demands, and subpoenas that will most assuredly be coming. And, of course, I think we should, even just for nothing else, but for political reasons, right? If you're just a pure partisan, you have to say, what does this mean? Be careful what you wish for, right? Because, I mean, I think the court was right in Mazars to identify that there are certain important separation of powers issues. And, this could easily come back to bite liberals, progressives who are desperate to see Trump's tax returns, depending on how an opinion is written, of course, because like I said, this is a somewhat different case. But if the court kind of issues a ruling that says, well, yeah, Congress can basically do that whenever it has a kind of a reasonable legislative purpose, well, that opens the door to an awful lot of stuff. And that could be, given our current political environment, that could be pretty rough, I think. And I'm a little apprehensive about that.
Yeah. Well, and I would say, again, the fact that this is a statute maybe makes it a little more blatant of a certain, and because it's aimed at sort of the individual executive, right? It's not, does Congress have oversight over the Justice Department to subpoena records from the FBI? Well, sure. Again, then there's limits, obviously, on that about what can be disclosed in ongoing investigations and all that. But the idea of agency oversight, right, or oversight over other branches of government or agencies of the executive, as opposed to the executive himself. Yeah, I think you can draw a distinction there.
Yeah. So, any thoughts as to how you expect this to play out? This particular case?
I haven't really thought it through a whole lot. I could easily see the court saying that they can get the records, the tax records, or maybe sort of look, you need a better showing to get the tax records. You can get them, but you've got to connect the dots to your legislative purpose a little better than what you've done so far, because this, for all the world, looks like you're just trying to get Donald Trump, which they are. So I think I could see that kind of
and I wonder, because of course, if Congress wants, it can pass legislation requiring that presidential candidates release tax returns. In fact, this was proposed a couple of years ago as part of the kind of everything in the kitchen sink HR 1. Didn't go anywhere.
I'm not sure that it can, but go ahead.
Well. Yeah. I guess you think the separation of powers issues might make that problematic then.
Yeah, I would say that the Constitution sets the qualifications for president, and Congress cannot add nor subtract from them.
So then I guess you could say that maybe that political parties could require that their candidates release tax returns, and that's not that kind of skirts that, but it's not like the Republican Party would do that necessarily.
Maybe. Let me think on that. I have to think on that one a little bit.
But I see what you're saying. That's in the end, though, honestly, I don't think it matters politically a whole lot because
most everybody does release them.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is kind of a Donald. Now maybe that will stop happening, but Donald Trump is in so many ways a unique case. And so, but even if Donald Trump released his tax returns and it's not like there's going to be a line saying, "Oh, this is the bribes I paid to X," or "Here's my reported income from Vladimir Putin," or something like that. I mean, so any of this stuff would be spun enough so that it wouldn't affect him politically. So I think, I don't see it mattering necessarily a whole lot politically, but I certainly will be interested in seeing how this plays out, or if it plays out before Republicans take over in January.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I said it would have been great to have Trey talk about this story. He's still recovering, and Trey, if you're listening to this, we hope to have you back soon. But take your time, and best wishes for a speedy recovery. But Elon Musk finally got what he wanted, Jay. I said, be careful what you wish for, right?
Free.
More than a little buyer's remorse, right? Because world's richest man now owns Twitter, which he acquired for $44 billion. The price he admits is inflated. My first thought on that, Jay, is maybe that's what you get when you think it'll be a fun goof to make an offer that you can put a 420 in. You kind of a call out to the, I mean, I did a little math, and if he would have offered 54 a share instead of 54.20 a share and had been accepted, you could have shaved more than around $500 million off of that. But I guess what's $500 million here
when you're the world's richest man.
Just pocket you. But anyway,
that's the luxury.
Yeah. Anyway, so Musk has to figure out now, right, how he can implement what he's wanted, a less restrictive content moderation policy, and make the company profitable. So part of that, let's lay off half the staff. He's well at work on that in typical Muskian sort of fashion. And just a couple of days ago, right, he tweeted that Twitter was experiencing what he called a massive drop in revenue due to activist groups pressuring advertisers, even though nothing has changed with content moderation. And we did everything we could to appease the activists. Extremely messed up. They're trying to destroy free speech in America. Now ad sales account for over 90% of Twitter's revenue. So Musk definitely has a strong interest in ensuring that this advertiser pause doesn't become an advertiser flight. And he understands that, right? In a previous tweet to advertisers, he wrote, Twitter obviously cannot become a free-for-all hellscape where anything can be said with no consequences, ! Because that's what you do. Twitter aspires to be the most respected advertising platform in the world that strengthens your brand and grows your enterprise. Now, Musk, who has previously said he would allow Donald Trump back on the platform, also said it would take weeks before Twitter could come up with a policy for reinstating any banned or suspended users. But it seems likely that there's going to be a home on Twitter for Donald Trump in plenty of time for him to use as a platform for his soon-to-be-announced 2024 presidential run, assuming he wants to leave the comfy confines of Truth Social and come back to Twitter. So, Jay, there's a lot here. What do you think about all of this?
Well, that's a broad question.
Yeah, I know.
It's kind of like, what do you think of the Roman Empire?
Yeah, exactly.
So I think Twitter will be better off, at least in terms of serving the idea that it's supposed to be allow people to say what they want, and with Musk in charge, I think it will get more. That will alleviate some of the right-wing paranoia. Some of it deserved, just because they're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. sense that big tech is shutting down their speech. And I think, it'll settle out. It'll sort itself out between advertisers and people going on there. Advertisers will figure out if they're getting bang for their buck by advertising, and some will stay, some will go. And there you go.
I agree, certainly. But I think this whole, I can understand the point of view of advertisers because Elon Musk is a volatile guy. He's an unpredictable guy. He's never been in a business like this where he's had to worry about advertisers. He said he hates advertising and, Tesla, SpaceX, all very different sort of things. And so if I'm an advertiser and I have this sort of wild card sort of person jump in with saying all this, and by the way, this week I'll tweet, some sort of a conspiracy theory about the attack on Pelosi. If I'm P&G or whatever, any other big advertiser, like, you know what? Maybe we take a break for a little bit and kind of wait to see how this plays out. But this whole, oh my God, Elon Musk clutching his pearls, and this is an attack on free speech. Give me a break, Jesus.
Well, though, I don't think you can deny though that there is this the whole freak out that the left had when Elon Musk said, "I think I'd like to buy Twitter," sort of gave away the game, right? That the idea is, oh my God, people might be able to say what they want without being properly moderated.
No, that's let me stop you there, because that's a mischaracterization of why people on the left were freaked out about it. People on the left were freaked out about it because they believe that there is an asymmetry in the amount of misinformation, disinformation that is being spread on Twitter, and that asymmetry is being driven by far-right folks who are like Donald Trump, obviously, and that if you have somebody who is okay with that sort of thing, like Elon Musk has at least implied that he is to some folks, then that is a threat to democracy. And that's why people on the left are freaked out, not because they're scared that people can say what they want. So I just wanted to, I guess I'm not seeing the distinction between, again, one man's misinformation, or today's misinformation is, next week's proven fact. And that's been a lot of the problem, right? With Twitter is people who would say things like, look, I think the virus started in a lab in Wuhan. Oh my God, that's misinformation. Well, until it's not. Hunter Biden's laptop is a fake. That's misinformation. Or Hunter Biden's laptop is a fake from foreign intelligence. Well, or I'm screwed up because Mike, I'm on the wrong day. Saying Hunter Biden's laptop is real is misinformation. I agree. There are distinctions.
And that's the problem.
Sure.
And the government will always define misinformation as what it doesn't want to hear. So.
But you would agree that there are just instances where people are just telling lies, and that's different.
Well, absolutely, yeah,
right. And so I think
what you going to do? I guess that
there are plenty of things you can do if you are, if you don't like that, you can move to another platform, right? Or if you are the platform, you can, choose certain different content moderation strategies. Or if you're advertisers and you realize that a large group of users are not okay with that, you can take your advertising dollars elsewhere.
Right. But all these, and I think that's fine, I guess. But
I think there are these people who cleverly
the idea though is to pressure someone into content moderation, right? And that's what I think is the problem.
Why is that a problem? I guess I'm trying to understand why that's a problem.
Well, because if you look to there's no content moderation clause in the First Amendment.
But Twitter is a private company. Do advertisers do they have some sort of an obligation to spend money on Twitter, to support Twitter? I mean, if you want to nationalize Twitter, that's a different conversation. We can have that conversation. But okay.
Well, we should, and at some point, as the emails come out between some of these tech platforms and the U.S. government, I think we will. But the idea that it's one thing to say, listen, I think this guy's lying. I think he's full of it. This is nonsense. It's disinformation. It's quite another bigger step to say, I want to make sure that no one hears this because it's disinformation. Now, look, you can say, look, that's not guaranteed by the First Amendment, and he's a private actor and all that, and we'll set aside any, dalliance with the state that might have gone on with this. But there's still this core fundamental Western idea, right? That people should be able to say what they want, even if it's absolute bullshit. That's part of our Western canon.
But they don't have the right to,
obviously, for things like libel and stuff like that. But
no, I would say yes and no. And the yes is, you're absolutely right. If you want to go on the street corner and, spew your garbage, you can certainly do that. But you don't have a right to space in the newspaper or online or anything like that. You don't have a right to someone else's platform to do that. If it's my platform, I get to say who wants to be on it. And that's a whole different issue. And that's why it just burns me up, these people saying it's a First Amendment issue, when, hey, this is not a public sphere. This is a private platform. If you don't like it, hey, there's Truth Social. On the left, if you don't like it, there's Mastodon apparently and some other things. But wrapping yourself in the First Amendment, I just think that's just ridiculous.
No, fair enough. And we'll put the First Amendment state action piece. We'll hold that in the bands.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
But let's call it a free speech issue. That if you are what you're saying, say that you want to do is allow people to say what they want and speak their mind and so forth, in however many characters or less, and then you're going to say, but only certain people, and we're going to decide who's who, and you're also pretending that you are sort of even-handed about it, and there's suspicions that you're not being even-handed about it. That all leads to the sense of paranoia that people have that the tech is censoring conservatives.
Right. And I think on the left, the argument is, well, if more conservatives are being banned through these content moderation policies, it's because there are more conservatives extremists who are violating these neutral rules. And so the problem isn't the rules,
but the
problem is conservative extremism.
Rules.
What's that?
Yeah, the problem is when pushed to, they can never really come up with what those neutral rules are.
I mean, I think that
in a lot of these various court cases.
I think the content moderation
was
policy
settled, right?
What's that? Go ahead. Sorry.
The one that was settled, where you did have emails from the White House. I mean, I think that's that's sort of a problem. But the idea here's the weird thing about this, right? Conservatives. And I'm speaking generally, right? I suppose I'm just speaking of my tribe, of the classically liberal, conservative tradition.
You guys could probably meet in the booth at Denny's right now, but anyway, go ahead.
Have no sense that, or have never really believed that. Oh my gosh, we need to have content moderation of the New York Times or of Facebook or Twitter. Right now, Josh Hawley, I suppose, would be the exception, but I don't count him. Ron
DeSantis,
in my tribe.
Yeah. But okay, yeah, not your tribe. And
the idea was, and this is what I want to say: is it Holmes who said this? That look, the remedy for bad speech or wrong speech is more speech, and that's been the sense that we've always been brought up to. Look, if someone's saying something that's untrue, well, okay, call them out on it.
God, I think that's so naive.
That's better for society.
I think that is just
to shut them up.
I think that's so naive. But I don't. Well, I don't disagree with it in total, but I think that it's based on certain 18th and 19th conceptions of media and the world and technology that no longer obtain today. So it would be nice if that were true, but it's not anymore. Unfortunately, I'm not saying I have a better solution. But this idea that the answer to incorrect speech or wrong speech or lies or more speech is, I just think it's more what Steve Bannon famously said a few years ago, right? Flood the zone with shit, and that's what you get. You just get shit flooded with more. Anyway, but that's
so. Let's do just a quick hypothetical,
sure,
though, and say that a year and a half ago, when we're fighting over school closures, people who said, listen, there's very little risk of the virus to children spreading, schools should be open. And then there was the response of shut up, it's a pandemic. Those were the types of people who were then labeled vaccine deniers or COVID deniers or whatever, who were removed from Twitter. It turns out they were right. Would we have been better off had that conversation taken place and the proponent says, listen, schools should be open because here's the science that says, it's not particularly harmful to kids, less transmissible, and so forth, and had that conversation as opposed to the shut up, you're banned. I'm thinking also of like the scientist who signed the Great Barrington letter, right, early on in COVID about this is how we ought to be handling it. I think you could make the big argument that a lot of them were right. But what happened was there wasn't the debate. There was the you're a conspiracy theorist, shut up, you're banned.
Well,
and that I think
that's a different issue. I think you see it as being a more clear cut than I do. But putting that aside, to me, the fundamental issue is does Twitter can Twitter be forced to be the forum for that conversation?
Well, if it opens itself up to say, hi, we're here to let you show up and talk about important social issues, and that's the value we provide to advertisers and to the end users, then yeah, I think so.
They can be forced.
And I would agree. It's not a constitutional question in and of itself, unless there's some connection with the government. But I think it's still a
yeah. See, I think Twitter gets to decide what its content moderation policies are and how those policies are interpreted. Now, what Twitter can't do is selectively enforce them. That's a different issue, certainly. But in terms of how they're interpreted, which is a much broader thing, right? Then that's up to them. And so maybe some people might say, well, maybe that's too fine of a distinction. I don't think so, but I admit that it can be a distinction that may be difficult to make. And certainly there are people who have been banned who have, taken legal action, and they have a right to do that.
This is just like a weird, and I'm sorry, because I know we're running short on time, but there's just something on the idea, because I get where you're coming from and where the left is coming from of the, we don't want one side or the other just to
flood the zone with shit.
Bannon's phrase, fill the zone with shit. I guess why do you have such a strong reaction to that? Whereas I, as a conservative, see the zone filled with shit all the time, and I'm like, well, there it is. I guess I think, and again, you can say that's because I'm extraordinary and I have the mental capacity to separate the good from the bad.
You joke about that, but that's exactly it. You joke about it, but no, seriously, that is absolutely it. I think you routinely and tragically underestimate the extent to which people and
just
the number
how stupid everyone else is.
Well, no, I won't say stupid because people have lives to live. They're not enmeshed in this. They weren't fortunate enough to have the educational opportunities and the freedom in a lot of ways in their lives that you and I have been fortunate enough to have, and a lot of the listeners to this show, it's by the fact that they're listening to it, suggests that they're probably part of that group. So yeah, absolutely, and that's my concern. Not that people are stupid, and certainly there are plenty of stupid people.
I'm not
right?
saying that there aren't,
right? But
not our listeners.
But that's not the bigger problem. The bigger problem is just human psychology being what it is and the demands of life being what they are, there's going to be, I think, a much larger group of people who are subject to that kind of manipulation, I think, to a greater extent that you and a lot of, I would say, folks in the libertarian movement, particularly, not that you're a libertarian, but you get what I'm saying here, believe. So that's, I think, where we differ on that. Yeah. So yeah, I don't think people are necessarily dumber than you think they are. We probably agree about people's relative, smartness, I guess.
Well, I would close with this, which was sort of a 19th century summation of that view, and that is Lincoln saying that you can fool some of the people all of the time and all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. And that sort of comes forward that, look, sometimes people will get fooled. Sometimes some people will always get fooled. But in the end, there is sort of a wisdom of crowds type thing that takes place, right? So
I see. I disagree. I mean, I would say, well, you can fool enough of the people enough of the time to really, really screw things up. So that was not part of Lincoln's thing. But it doesn't matter what doesn't matter if all the people can or can't be fooled. All you really need is to fool enough people to go along with your minimum winning coalition to get into power and do your worst, basically. Yeah, you have to work.
Doesn't really trip off the tongue.
No, it doesn't really. So, oh well. We are running long, but because this is our last episode before the midterm elections, maybe some people will be listening to this after the midterms, I expect. So, do you have any final thoughts about the midterms, just so we can get those in?
Red tsunami. No, I think it's going to be a good night for Republicans. Across the board, I'm sticking with my Senate pickup of 2.
Yeah. I mean, to me,
the curiosity will be, and this may be a source of some tension, will be Pennsylvania counting votes. And will votes not postmarked be counted and so forth?
Right. Yeah. And
if it's close and comes to that,
we may not know yet for a while. And, to me, I'll stick with my predictions. And again, to me, it's the fundamentals, from some historical standard from 1938 to 2018, there have been 6 presidents with approval ratings in that 40 to 45% range where Joe Biden's hanging out right now. And in midterms, they've averaged a loss of 4 Senate seats and 36 House seats. Now, there's been some fairly wide variation in those 6 instances, but
and the Senate seat obviously can vary just based on who's on the calendar.
Yeah, but in general, that's kind of in the range of what the latest forecasts seem to predict. And so when in doubt, I always say, look at the record and go with the fundamentals. And the fundamentals suggest, as you pointed out, that it should be a pretty solid night for Republicans. And I would be very surprised if it's anything but that. All right. Well, then that brings us to the end of our episode. If you're listening, thanks so much. If you're not, I don't know what's going on here. Turn off your phone. If you're not listening, anyway. But if you're not already a supporter, hey, we hope you'll consider becoming one. Without supporters, we could not keep doing this week after week. And, when you become a supporter, it's not just that warm glow of helping keep that debate going, but it's also you get free ad-free versions of everything we put out. There's our supporter-exclusive midweek show. Jay and I are going to be doing that in just a minute. We're going to be talking about ESG investing, ending the Electoral College, the supposed Supreme Court crisis. We got a lot. It should be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to it. But anyway, you get all that. There's other stuff at various levels. Check it out. Go to patreon.com/politicsguys. There's also our very active Politics Guys Discord group that's available to supporters. On Venmo, you can support us. We're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. All of our support links are always in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. But if you would like to get that midweek show, but you're just not in a position financially to support us, send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get you set up with access to that midweek show. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help us out if you let other folks know about the show. And of course, the best way to do that in today's world is through social media. We'd appreciate that, as well as subscribing and rating, reviewing the show on whatever podcast app you use. And finally, a special thanks to our fantastic executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. Jay and I will be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.